Hi, this is Tara. Today let's study Sutra number 35. What does it say? viṣayavatī va pravṛttiḥ utpannā manasaḥ sthiti-nibandhinī. Viṣayavatī is sensuous, that is pertaining to the sense object. Pravṛttiḥ, activity. Utpannā, that is arisen. Manasaḥ, mind. Sthiti, staying still. Nibandhinī, bonds, binds. Okay, so according to Maharishi Ved Vyasa, it's translated as or higher sense activity appearing causes mental steadiness. So very simply put, before we even get into all the explanations, what is he basically saying? He's saying that if the mind binds to a sense object, it can gain steadiness, or if a mind binds to a sense object, it can gain steadiness. Now what does this mean? Because so far we have been learning that you have to seize the vrittis, the modifications of the mind. So now why should our mind bind to a sense object? Let us see the technique. The power to cognize superphysical, which one gets by concentrating upon the forepart of the nose, is the higher olfactory sense activity. So he begins by explaining, and this is part of the yogic process, that when you concentrate on the tip of the nose, you may notice that even in Buddhist meditation, Hindu meditations at the very basic level, the first thing they will do is ask you to focus on the tip of the nose. This creates a higher olfactory activity. Okay, it gets, as your concentration gets better, the ability to sense is becoming more refined and more subtle. So basically what happens is there are different parts of the nose and the tongue which, depending on the concentration, you are able to take the sensory perception to a more refined, to a more subtle level. That is what Maharishi Ved Vyasa explains. Tip of the nose, it is smell. By concentrating on the fore part of the tongue, the power to cognize taste over palate. The palate is the cognition of color. In the middle of the tongue, cognition of touch. In the root of the tongue is the cognition of sound. So depending on where you concentrate, he says, your sensory activity becomes more refined, more subtle, and the mind can become concentrated. By this, the higher sense activity, which is caused by concentrating upon the moon, the sun, the planets, jewels, the lamp, precious stones, is also to be understood to have that name. So although whatever of the nature of an object known by any science, by inference, or by the instruction of the teacher is of course true, because they are capable of establishing the truth by teaching, yet as long as even a portion is not known by one's own senses, everything remains as if it were unknown. So even if you have inferred it, if you have learnt it by science, even if a teacher has taught it to you, until you actually have perceived it with your own sense organs, you cannot know that it is true. The knowledge of such subtle matters as the state of absolute freedom does not obtain firm ground in the mind. You are not really convinced, right? So we experience this in our daily lives also, where somebody says, oh, if you do this, then you'll experience this. Let's give an example of, if you eat salt, you will know, oh, it is salty. What is the nature of salt? The nature of salt is salty. So somebody can tell you this, they can describe it to you, they can say, oh, it is salty. But until you put it on your tongue, you don't know what salty is. How can somebody describe what is salty to you? They can say it's not sweet. They can say it's not bitter. But what is salty? Until it is on your tongue, you have no clue, right? Similarly. So therefore, he's saying that when one portion of what is when taught is perceived, the subject remaining portions are easily believed. It is for this very reason that this mental concentration on sense objects is taught. Swami Satyananda explains it as, or else the mind can be made steady by bringing it into the activity of sense experience. So this sutra describes an additional technique because it begins with or. Okay, which may be followed by those who are not able to practice Ishvara Pranidhana or even the Mahabandhas or Pranayamas. Maybe, some of us don't have the capacity. So it is true. So there are, what he is basically emphasizing is that there are multiple paths. It is true that many aspirants find it difficult to practice pranayama on account of a lack of proper guidance, nutrition, the mind doesn't concentrate. So the sutra is giving you a simpler method to concentrate the mind. Here it is to observe itself through sense perception. So Swami Satyananda makes this point very beautifully. He says you are not observing the sense object. The mind is observing itself through the sense object. Please keep that in mind. Okay, by merging the mental consciousness into the sense perceptions, the mind comes under control. So a great example of this is Trataka, okay, where you observe the lamp and then the mind merges into the lamp and becomes absorbed into it. This kind of concentration is what he is talking about. You can practice this even, say, with a flower. You can practice it with an idol. You can practice it with a symbol. So these are all forms of concentrating the mind and merging it into samadhi through the object of perception. You are not observing the object of perception. You are observing the mind through the object of perception. Please note that difference. And he also says a sophisticated person may not find this interesting because it is a very gross level of meditation. But it is true that if one goes deep, one can control the mind by making it sound conscious. This is the principle of Nada Yoga. The mind can also be controlled through Trataka. So what he's talking about, Nada Yoga, is sound. And so basically, taste consciousness is developed by concentrating on the front of the tongue, color visions on the palate, psychic touch by concentrating on the central part of the tongue, and psychic sound by concentrating on the root of the tongue. All these psychic processes become the basis of self-control. And this can be taken up as a sadhana. And he says that all of our Indian traditions, the practices, for instance, bhajan, kirtan, japa, music, okay, where the singer can sing one line over and over again, it becomes a basis of concentration. Okay, so Swami Vivekananda says that these forms of concentration that bring extraordinary sense perceptions cause perseverance of mind. So he says these come naturally with dharana, concentration. If the mind is concentrated on the tip of the nose, one begins to smell. After a few days, wonderful perfumes. If it becomes concentrated at the root of the tongue, one begins to hear sounds. Tip of the tongue, taste wonderful flavors. Middle of the tongue, one feels as if you are coming into contact with something, touch perception. If one concentrates the mind on the palate, he begins to see peculiar things. If a man whose mind is disturbed wants to take up these practices of yoga, yet doubts the truth of them, what happens when you basically undertake a meditative process which has a physical outcome? You become convinced, which is why the physical concentration, the concentration on sense objects, is very, very useful, but at a gross level. If the mind doesn't have the capacity to go to the abstract concentrations, use physical objects. What happens is when you start seeing the results, Swami Vivekananda says, your doubts are dissolved and then you are able to progress. So for instance, you might say, what is this? I don't really understand. What is this chitta vritti nirodha? I'm not seeing any results. Is it true? Why am I simply doing this? You concentrate, say, on the root of the tongue. You get taste perceptions, you get sense perceptions, taste, color, touch, and then you say, okay, every time I do this, I get that result, so therefore I know it is true. You're correlating, you're getting convinced, and you're able to move into the abstract levels. BKS Iyengar says, or by contemplating an object that helps to maintain steadiness of mind and consciousness. One may equally attain an exalted state of consciousness by becoming totally engrossed with dedication and devotion into an object of interest. The practice of contemplating upon an object is the foundation of mental stability, and total absorption in the object brings about direct perception of its essence. So this sutra shows how to develop awareness and sensitivity in intelligence. In doing so, one may gain insight into the phenomena of nature as well as the nature of the seer. So Osho says, when meditation produces extraordinary sense perceptions, the mind gains confidence, and this helps perseverance. If you work out your breathing pattern and you find the secret keys, how to change the climate of the mind, how to control your moods, if you work from both the poles, that will be better. Okay, so the example he gives, for instance, is if you have taken LSD, marijuana, all these kinds of things, which honestly I don't know much about, but basically they are mind-altering drugs. So you get these extrasensory perceptions, and you may see things like, for instance, something will become luminous, something will become radiant, something will go trippy, you know. So it's basically that, but it is achieved through the concentration on the tip of the nose and on the parts of the tongue. He says you don't need to take all these things. If you have the concentration, use these sense objects as concentration, you can go into the layers of sensory perception, and people around you are no more the same. He says, Osho says, your wife becomes the most beautiful woman in the world if you are able to develop these extrasensory perceptions. Everything changes with your clarity of perception. And he says, when your eyes change, everything changes. So basically what is happening? The object is not changing. Though BKS Iyengar tells us, we are also going into the layers of the object. We are no longer just seeing it as a solid whole, because our perception is becoming more and more refined. The ultimate purpose of this kind of concentration is that the more you see the results, the more you become convinced that you are on the right path. Barbara Stoller Miller says, or when the mind's activity arisen in the sense world is held still. So basically, when it is you're able to perceive the mind's activity in the sense world, the mind becomes still, which is ultimately the aim. Thank you so much for listening. Come back tomorrow for Sutra number 36. Please do remember to like, share and subscribe.